Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, so this is the last part of this chapter, chapter 4. We're still in part 3 then, procedure of pure phenomenology and respective methods and problems. And this is the 4th chapter, theory of the noetic, noematic structures, elaboration of the problems. So the last section of this chapter, I really didn't like it actually. I didn't get as much out of this as I did out of the first 2 sections that we covered in the last 2 videos, and I didn't find it. I found it kind of difficult to get what Husserl was really trying to say in some parts of this last part of this chapter, and quite repetitive actually as well. So that there was a lot of good stuff in the last 2 videos. I thought this one not so much, but this is my summary of it anyway. So the first section is secondary types of positings. So these secondary types of positings that Husserl's talking about include things like the affective, appetitive, and volitional noeses. So talking about feelings, desires, will, that kind of thing. These are secondary to the ones that the kind of more foundational ones that we've already talked about. And these represent basically a similar modification as we saw regarding the modes of belief. So these kind of alter the flavor or the signature or the register, as has been suggested for this, a word that's been suggested for this as well. But they also have their own doxological character. So a similar modification to the Doxic modification we looked at before, but a modification that also admits of this Doxic quality. And the idea with these, or what these do, is they yield a totally new dimension of meaning. So here we're moving from the material to values of the materials. So we're starting to look at things here like beauty, ugliness, goodness, badness, usefulness, etc. And so that's when I say values of the materials instead of the materials themselves, that's material in that sense we looked at a few videos back, the hyletic material, raw materials versus the noetic or the intentional. And of course, as Husserl always stresses, these noeses have a noematic correlate with the appropriate thetic characters. So things like valuable, pleasing, joyous, etc. And that seems to be kind of important. Husserl wants to stress that at every point in this chapter when we've talked about a certain noesis, he always stresses that this comes with a noematic correlate. So that's something that Husserl felt was important enough to stress every single time he talked about it. And it's interesting too, where he says each of these noeses possesses a noematic correlate with the appropriate thetic characters. So thetic here, this word, is starting to be separated from doxa, which was how we originally used it, thetic pertaining to the noesis of doxic, the doxic qualities, the doxic characters, being. But now it's starting to, in this last section of this chapter, Husserl is adding to this meaning. So they're similar. They're analogous to the doxic character, but basically more general is the sense that I get here. So it seems like thetic is essentially an extension of positing, a more general kind of mode of being, if you like, or a more general word to describe the being of these different noeses that we're talking about now. And these secondary noeses also admit of the neutrality modification, so they therefore can be positional as opposed to neutralized. Remember, positional is that potential capacity for carrying out actual acts of positing, i.e. doxa, as opposed to the neutralized, which were those shadow positings, the as if of fancy and maybe assumption. We kind of, depending on what part of assumption you wanted to emphasize. So every act, as also every act correlate, harbors explicitly or implicitly a logical factor. It can always be made logically explicit, by which I think Husserl means with regard to its positional character, which is now getting this more generalized, this general term thetic, to capture the idea that it's not just limited to doxa, but also includes these other kinds of beings, these other kinds of being that we're looking at here. Affective, appetitive, volitional, those kinds of things, these secondary types of positings. And there's an important quote which I wanted to give you for this section. All acts generally, even the acts of feeling and will, are objectifying acts, original factors in the constituting of objects, the necessary sources of different regions of being and of the ontologies that belong therewith. For example, the valuing consciousness constitutes over against the mere world of positivity the typically new axiological objectivity, a being of a new region. So this is why I wanted to highlight this, because it seems like an important idea here. These secondary types of positings aren't mere additions to objects which already pre-exist the secondary type of positing. Rather, they're fully objectifying acts in themselves, playing a role in the constitution of the objects. So it's not that these secondary noeses, these secondary positings, aren't being added to something which already exists as an object. They have a foundational role in the constituting of that object. The object is constituted as valuable. It's not constituted and then given this extra quality of value. The object itself, in its essence, is valuable to us. It's constituted as valuable. And in doing so, these secondary types of positings open up new regions of being, i.e., in addition to the doxic ones that we've already looked at, these new regions of being related to the type of positing they are, affective, appetitive, volitional, those kinds of things. And so that's the secondary types of positings. The next section is synthetic consciousness. So with this, the first thing that Husserl says is he's not discussing the unity or the synthesis. So that's what we're talking about, synthesis, bringing together, unifying. He's not discussing the unity of immanent time consciousness or of things in space. So those are also synthetic in the sense that they are unified. They unify disparate phases into a single whole, but he's not analyzing those here. Rather, he has in mind what he calls articulated syntheses. And these are the distinctive ways in which discrete, discontinuous acts are bound together in an articulated unity, in the unity of a synthetic act of a higher order. So basically just taking individual theses individual noetic characters and their correlated noema as well, and adding them together into a single whole, into a unified whole. So multiple theses being put together, synthesized into a unified whole. And so he has in mind here things like the collective, so taking things together, the disjunctive, concerning the this or that. These two parts can be apprehended together in one consciousness. The explicative, so explaining more detail, relating, those kinds of operations where you have a kind of a total synthesis which is made up of a number of different individual theses. So I'll give you a quote for this one. Every synthetically unitary consciousness, however many special theses and syntheses it may involve, possesses the total object which belongs to it as a synthetically unitary consciousness. We call it a total object, in contrast with the objects which belong intentionally to the lower or higher grade members of the synthesis. So there, the important thing, one object for the synthesis as a unified whole. It may be made up of a number of individual separate objects, but the synthesis itself, the synthesized consciousness, if you like, the synthetic consciousness, only has one object. So that's the idea. And each noesis contributes to the constitution of this total object. And Husserl talks about many rays being turned on the object. So you've got this one object with these many rays of the different noeses constituting it, bringing it about. And in this sense, the synthetic consciousness is a plural consciousness, or what he also calls polythetic. But even though it's polythetic, again, we are essentially and originally aware of them as singular, as monothetic. And that's essentially what we're talking about here, taking a plural and turning them into a singular. So taking a polythetic situation, the case where you have multiple noetic theses, and turning them into a singular, a monothesis, if you like, monothetic. And everything we've said about neutrality and positionality applies here as well. These modifications depend on the character of the grounding noeses. So all of the different noeses that go into constituting this total object are what determines whether the synthetic consciousness is neutralized, or what kind of positionality it has, etc. He also talks about Doxic syntactics in this section. And this is basically just the way that the synthetic consciousness is expressed or arranged. And essentially, he's talking about those kinds of connecting words like and, or, if, because, and thus. Those are the 5 that he mentions, but they surely aren't the extent of them. And these, he says, appear as doxic, presumably because they automatically imply a mode of being, but they aren't merely doxic. They can also be axiological, related to values, and practical, related to use, which we've already seen. Hence why we're using that word thetic now in that more general sense to extend this original meaning that it had confined to doxa. And regarding the way that the articulated synthesis is carried out, Husserl says that this is a step-by-step process. So the thesis or synthesis becomes insofar as the pure ego actually advances step by step. Itself lives in the step and steps on with it. So the pure ego, that cogito, is engaged in this process. It's a lived process. The cogito, the pure ego, is involved in each step. It's a step-by-step process where these syntheses, where these theses are brought together into this synthetic whole, but the cogito is living in each step as it happens. So it's not an abstract, reflective type of activity. It's engaged. That the pure ego or the cogito is living each step as it carries them out. And just as a quick kind of example of this, Husserl talks of each thesis having a point of insertion, which is the origin for the positing. And this he describes as the apprehending and taking possession of. So this is kind of like the first step, if you like. We've got our thesis. We're positing this thesis. It's become a complete, clear thesis in and of itself. Then we move from this mode of insertion to another mode, the mode of having in one's grasp. And so now we've solidified our hold on this thesis. Then we move into another mode towards the synthesis, where now we still maintain in its grasp or we still maintain in our grasp what we had just grasped. So now we have to, with a view to taking on another thesis, we have to still maintain this original thesis in our grasp, even though our focus is no longer explicitly on it. So all of these different kinds of subtle steps Husserl has in mind when he's talking about this step-by-step process to create this synthetic consciousness, a consciousness made up of multiple theses. And related to this, then, Husserl also talks about the pure ego withdrawing, or the capacity of the pure ego to withdraw from theses and turn to other thema, he starts calling it. But when it does so, the former is still apprehended, just no longer in thematic grasp. And his example here is a whistle distracting me, turning me aside from my thema momentarily. But when I return to the thema, the apprehension of the sound is not blotted out. It's not lost. We're still conscious of the whistle, just in a modified way. We no longer hold it in our mental grasp. We no longer explicitly focus on it. However, the whistle is not related to the thema. Therefore, this testifies to the capacity of consciousness for holding simultaneous, unrelated themata in its explicit grasp. And that's essentially what we're talking about, the way that synthetic consciousness can build up or include multiple noeses and noemata into an articulated, unified whole. Whether or not they're related to each other, it's the synthetic consciousness still has this capacity to bring these different theses together and hold them all in its grasp at once as a whole. And that's what he's talking about. He doesn't go into a huge amount of detail on this, but Aaron Gurwitch is someone who has gone into a lot of detail regarding this. And if you're interested, The Field of Consciousness is the book to go for with this. And he talks about, he breaks up our kind of awareness into three distinct spheres. And we've talked about this before actually as well, and it's come up in the comments section. He talks about a theme, and then a thematic field, and then a margin on the outside, or towards the exterior. And we have covered this very briefly as well earlier on in ideas, and it's just kind of slipping back in here, but again very briefly covered very briefly looked at by Husserl here. So anyway, that's that, and there's a tiny little section about vagueness and distinctness, which I just thought I'd mention. He says an act can appear as vague, as in when it occurs to us, but we don't necessarily direct any explicit attention towards it. And the opposite, making the act distinct and clear, happens when we direct our glance single ray-wise upon it, is his expression. So basically, it's a pretty straightforward idea, but it's quite subtle. This is what I quite like about Husserl. He's identifying these really subtle cues in consciousness, the way that something can kind of appear to us in the background, in our we are aware of it, but it's not at the center of our field of attention. It's kind of hovering in the background. It's vague, so that's Husserl's word, but it's still something that we have to consider if we want to explain and describe consciousness properly. But it's just the nature of what it is. It's just the nature of what consciousness is to include these kinds of things. So we're not in the realm of these clear-cut distinctions. Consciousness isn't something that admits of like scientific precision and certainty and quantification. It includes these nebulous, hazy kind of zones where we're sort of aware of it, but we're not fully aware of it. And Husserl that's the beauty of phenomenology. It doesn't shy away from those states. It just jumps headfirst into them and says this is the way it is, even though we can only describe it with words like hazy and ambiguous. That's just what consciousness is. Get over it. Get used to it. So that's cool. And the final section today, expression. So in this section, Husserl basically wants to extend the meaning of the word meaning, because formally it's been restricted to verbal expressions. So speech is what we've tied the word meaning in with. If you are speaking, then that is where meaning comes from. And he wants to kind of reverse that. He wants to make meaning more foundational than speech. Speech is meaningful only because it has this, it belongs to this deeper, broader category called meaning. And that's kind of the goal. So he talks about an object being presented with a definite meaning. We can then, he says, discriminate, making the given meaning more explicit, and relate the discriminated parts or phases within a unity, following some such scheme as this is white. So that adopting this expression, this is white, this is a process which adds a new stratum to the meaning, and it makes the meaning more explicit and expressible. So something that already has a meaning when we can add another level to this object, and the level that we're adding is something which brings the meaning out more, makes it more explicit, makes it more amenable to expression. And so what Husserl is saying is that every meaning can be expressed conceptually. Every meaning can be expressed conceptually. Every meaning can be turned into an expressible conceptual sentence, or it can be turned into language. And so what he's ultimately saying is that logical meaning is an expression. So expression is actually this logical meaning which precedes then speech. Speech is just the articulation of this, if you like. It's pointing out what this deeper meaning is, but it's not in and of itself meaningful. It gets its meaning because it's already connected with this deeper level of meaning that Husserl has in mind, the meaning of the noema. And so that's kind of one of the main points from this that I took away from this. Expression has nothing to do with verbal sounds. And in fact, he says the verbal sound can be referred to as expression only because the meaning which belongs to it expresses. So the meaning is foundational. It's not that the expression gives us the meaning. The expression expresses, or the expression is meaningful only because it already takes up this meaning, which is itself expressible, which can be expressed conceptually. So again, just kind of trying to ground meaning not in language and words and speech, but grounding it in the noema. And it's from there, and every noema is fundamentally expressible. And that's where expression gets, or that's where speech gets its expressive character from the noema. It doesn't create it itself. It doesn't, just because it's speech, it's not meaningful. It's meaningful only because the meaning which it takes up already expresses itself. Hopefully that's clear. I'm pretty sure that makes sense. This really reminds me of Heidegger in Being and Time, where he talks about discourse. He says exactly the same thing, but instead of expression, his word is discourse. So discourse we usually associate with speech, with language, but he says there discourse has a deeper grounding in meaning. And it's exactly what Husserl says here. Levinas says the same thing. Speech is not, or meaning doesn't come from the language. There's a deeper source, and the language is just, it's one way of expressing it, but it's tapping into this more original meaning. And so then there's some more repetition. What we said about vagueness and distinctness earlier, that applies here as well. And he also adds this extra section about completeness and incompleteness. So he says, expression is complete when the stamp of conceptual meaning has been fixed upon all the synthetic forms and significations of the lower layer. Incomplete when this is only partially effected. So, fair enough, if you want your meaning to be complete, then, or if you want your expression to be complete, the meaning has to be fixed upon all of the different individual theses within the synthetic consciousness. And if this is only partially done, then that is incomplete. It's the definition that Husserl gives it, or it's the word that Husserl uses to describe that situation. Incompleteness also arises, he says, in relation to the general nature of expressions. There is in the very nature of expressions, the general character that they bear, there is this inherent incompleteness. And so that's all I have for expression. Let's hit a summary. So first we looked at secondary types of positings. These are the affective, appetitive and volitional noeses, along of course with their associated noemata. And this represented a new dimension of meaning. So instead of just the raw materials, we're talking now about the value that those raw materials have. Or we're constituting the objects, those materials, with some value. And these are fully objectifying acts. So these secondary types of positings, they're not extra additions on top of an object which has already been formed. They are an original factor in the constitution of objects. Then we looked at synthetic consciousness, and this is where you have individual theses articulated into a synthetically unitary consciousness. And the important thing here was that this resulted in one object, what Husserl called the total object. And all of the different theses represent, or they were all rays, multiple rays directed towards this object. But, and this is another important idea, those multiple noeses were apprehended in the singular as well. So even though we're talking about a polythetic consciousness, it manifests, it is originally only singular. We never have this experience of multiple consciousnesses, of polythetic, of a polythetic kind of. We never experience the polythetic nature of our consciousness. It's always experienced as a unity, as a unified whole. We looked at Doxic syntactics in relation to this, and these are just the ways that synthetic consciousness is constructed out of these individual theses, and that's the kind of connecting words like and, or, if, because, and thus. Those were the 5 that he mentioned. And finally, we looked at expression. And expression is just logical meaning. So it has a broader definition than we normally give it. Expression relates to not just speech and speech acts, but to meaning itself. And meaning comes from the noemata. And that includes then the noeses. And so now we're in the realm of phenomenology, not linguistics anymore. And so that was really the main point. This has nothing to do with speech. Speech is expressive only because the meaning which belongs to it itself expresses. All right, cool. So that's where I'm going to wrap up today, a little bit shorter. Like I said, this was 25 pages, but there was a lot of repetition in it, and it was quite unclear in places, I thought. So I've kind of tried to extract something, what I could from it, especially that last section on expression. There's a lot that I didn't even didn't even include because, it was just seemed kind of drifting. The character of this last part of the chapter just didn't seem as focused as it has been in some other sections. Anyway, that's just me. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.